So tonight we are welcoming two speakers to share with us thoughts on the challenges facing the LGBTQ plus community in Tennessee and somewhat in the United States. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers, Emma Chen, Communications and Policy Manager at the Campaign for Southern Equality, and Naomi Goldberg, Executive Director of the Movement Advancement Project. I'm going to turn it over to Emma to start us off.
Hi, y'all. My name's Emma. I use she, her pronouns. I'm at the Campaign for Southern Equality. We are a regional LGBT rights organization that's based in Asheville, North Carolina, but we have staff across the South, and I live here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a lifelong Tennessean. Yeah, and just really excited to be talking to y'all about all of the challenges that are facing LGBTQ folks here in our state.
And I'm Naomi Goldberg. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Movement Advancement Project, which is a think tank focused on speeding equality and opportunity for all. We have a large LGBTQ program. We're celebrating our 20th year as an organization this year. I am based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I've been doing LGBTQ policy for about 18 years. And I'm really excited to talk about what's happening right now because we're definitely in a unique moment. So just an overview of what we're going to cover tonight. As Marilyn mentioned, we'll make sure there's time at the end for questions and happy to stay on for, more of that robust conversation. Emma's going to give a current policy landscape overview of what's happening in Tennessee around LGBTQ issues. I'll focus a little bit more on the national landscape and where Tennessee fits into that, as well as some of the federal issues. And then we do really want to spend some time talking about ways to get involved, things that you can do if you are interested. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Emma. And feel free to put questions in the chat if that's useful. I know Marilyn's going to be monitoring that too.
Awesome. So I'm going to start by going through the current policy landscape for LGBT Tennesseans. So these are all policies that are already in existence. Before I do that, I kind of want to give a bit of context. So as I'm sure many of y'all are aware, there's a group of lawmakers in Tennessee who have really made it their mission to sort of go after the rights of minority communities and working class people in Tennessee. I'm sure y'all are familiar with things like the school vouchers issue, where funding is being diverted away from our public schools and into private schools, or things like Medicaid expansion, where our lawmakers are really refusing to expand healthcare access for Tennesseans who may need it. Um, so this really fits into that context. Tennessee is often a policy laboratory for the nation. So really conservative policies will get tested out here and then we'll see them on the national level, especially now that we have the Trump administration in the White House, who are, really trying to see what they can do in terms of conservative policy. Um, so just, before I get into all of this, I just wanted to say that like LGBT rights policies aren't really on an island. They're really fitting into this sort of wider ecosystem of these lawmakers who are trying to push for more conservative policies and seeing how they can use policy to sort of disenfranchise minority communities. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the policies that we already have on the books. It's going to be kind of a lot, but bear with me. So in terms of LGBTQ youth, Tennessee has a ban on trans youth participating in sports that align with their gender. So a trans girl, for example, could not play on the girls' basketball team at her Tennessee high school. She would not be allowed to play. We also have a ban on transgender youth using school facilities. So that means that a trans boy, for example, would not be able to use the boys' bathroom at his school. He would often have to go to a single stall bathroom. Some of our schools maybe only have one or two of those that are pretty far away. So that kind of creates an issue for those students, they're trying to go to the bathroom really quickly in between classes. I think we can all remember that. And it's difficult if there's only one and it's on the third floor. So that's an issue that those students face. We also have a Don't Say LGBT school censorship law. And it basically says that in order to learn about gender identity issues in our Tennessee schools, parents have to sign a form allowing their students to learn that curriculum. So they have to be opted into it rather than trans and gender diverse students just being represented in our school curriculum as, a population that exists. Um, we also have a policy that we call a forced outing bill. So that policy says that if a student goes to their teacher and says, "Hey, I actually use they, them pronouns," or "I want you to call me by this different name that really aligns more with my gender," the teacher then by law is required to tell the student's parents about that. Um, and that really can put that student at risk if their parents aren't accepting of them and maybe they aren't safe at home with their parents. So that can be an issue for students for sure. We also have a policy that we call like a pronoun bill, which says that it essentially says that teachers at schools or any school staff are not required to use a student's pronouns. So if a student says, "I use they, them pronouns, please refer to me using they and them," a teacher can say, "No, I'm not legally required to do that, so I'm going to call you this because that's what I want to do." Um, so those are the school policies. We also have some policies related to discrimination of LGBT people. So Tennessee has a law that prevents cities and towns from passing ordinances that say you cannot discriminate against LGBT people, for example. So if Nashville wanted to pass an ordinance that says, we're not going to discriminate against LGBT people. That's a violation of our discrimination policies here in this city. They're not allowed to do that. The state actually like prevents them from doing that. So that's a pretty unique policy that we have here in Tennessee and a few other states. Moving on to healthcare. So Tennessee, within the last few years, has banned gender affirming medical care for transgender youth. So in the state of Tennessee, it used to be completely legal across the country, including in Tennessee, for youth to receive medications that can maybe block the onset of puberty, if they're identifying as transgender and need to take a little bit more time to figure out their identity. Um, you could go on like hormone therapy once you reach puberty. Um, yeah, and now at this point, those treatments are illegal in Tennessee. So youth who are once accessing those have to leave the state to get that health care. Um, the state Medicaid policy also explicitly excludes gender affirming care from coverage. So if you're on Medicaid and you're an adult, you can't get your gender affirming care covered. Um, and then the state also excludes gender affirming care from state employee health plans. So if you're a state employee, you can't get that health care covered either. Um, Tennessee also criminalizes the transmission of HIV and may require people to be registered as a sex offender if they transmit HIV, which can be very problematic for people living with HIV, which is a disease and not a crime. Moving on to ID documents. So many trans people choose to update the gender marker on their ID document to reflect their gender presentation. But in Tennessee, it is not legal to change your gender marker. So if you're a trans woman or a trans man and you want your gender marker to reflect your identity and the way that you appear, you cannot do that, which creates a really dangerous situation for a lot of trans people who may be showing their ID, um, and a law enforcement official, for example, might be confused and be like, it says that you are a female, but you do not look like a female. Is this you? Are you impersonating someone? That kind of thing. So it's creates a risky situation for trans people. And I know that was a lot. I'm sorry. We have a lot of anti-LGBT laws in Tennessee, but I'll pass it to Naomi to talk a little bit more about how Tennessee fits into the national context.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. So we at MAP track state laws and policies across the country, including in all 50 states, DC, and the territories. And so it's a really helpful way to sort of think about what Emma shared and what's happening in a particular state, but also where that fits into the broader national trends. So if we look here at this map, you can see that we're tracking sort of a cluster of laws that have recently really swept the country. So there's four of them. I think nearly all of them are ones that Emma has mentioned. State laws banning trans youth, accessing medical care, sports bans, bathroom bans, and then bills defining or laws defining sex to only be male or female and often immutable, something that can't be changed and determined at birth. So if we look at this cluster of four laws, you can see states that have passed none of them all the way to four. And so you can see in that dark kind of burnt orange, red color, brown color, those are states that have passed all four of these since 2020. And this is really helpful to sort of see the pace at which this has happened, that prior to 2020, no states had any of these laws. And so the pace of change is really noteworthy, and the fact that these laws are kind of hanging together and a real focus on anti-trans legislation. Although certainly, as Emma mentioned, there's broader bills and laws that have been moving both in Tennessee and in other parts of the country, focused on schools, focused on parental notification laws, both in schools and in healthcare, as well as sort of some censorship laws beyond the school context, things like drag bans, and efforts to kind of stifle pride. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as I said, we at MAP track these laws and policies across the country, and we put them all together to sort of, we score them all and put them all together in a tally, just as a way to compare state across state, what do we see? So if you look at the map on the left in June 2020, this is sort of where we were, where the states in dark green are our high policy tally. So those are states that have passed a lot of positive laws or policies that help LGBTQ people and their families. Those states have things like explicit non-discrimination for employment and housing and public accommodations, which is like restaurants and banks, places that you go in your day-to-day life. They may also have laws that make sure that trans people can update their driver's license so that when they're going to the bank or to the grocery store, they have an identity document that's accurate. These states also have a lot of protections for LGBTQ families, making sure that families like mine, where there's two moms, both parents can be legally recognized as parents to their children. And then we have states in the dark red, and so these are states that have a negative policy tally, and so these are states that have more negative laws than positive laws. So you can see in 2020 where those were sort of clustered around the southern region of the country and the kind of Great Plains, Upper Plains states. And then if you fast forward to 2026, where we are now, you can see there's been some change, not a lot, but what the story that we think is really impactful here is that good states are passing more and more protective laws. And states that have had anti-LGBTQ laws for a long time are continuing to pass more of them. And so, as Emma mentioned, some of these states like Tennessee and Florida have really become laboratories for innovation in terms of how to pass more and more anti-LGBTQ laws that reach into more and more parts of people's lives. So that just is a little bit of helpful of where we sit across the country. You can go to the next slide. This is where the screen share for those two different maps.
Okay.
Emma's just going to switch for a second to, Emma, you can go ahead and click play. So this is going to show the states that have passed bans on medically necessary care for trans youth. And again, what we're seeing here from 2020 to 2025 is that there were no states in 2020 that had bans on trans youth accessing healthcare with the care of a doctor that's medically necessary and to help support them. But where we end up in 2026 is having 27 states that have these laws in place, and you can see where they fall. And what's interesting here when we look at a map like this is that there are entire regions of the country where trans youth can't drive a short distance to access care. But then we have some states that are sort of clustered where they are becoming places where folks can go to get care. So, for example, Colorado is definitely a place where youth from other states have been coming. And Emma's going to share a bit more later on about what efforts have been happening to make sure that kids can continue to get the care that they need. Emma, we can go to the other one. So before you hit go, I'll just explain. So this map is a similar one. So this is tracking from 2017 to now. That shouldn't say 2020. That should say 2026, 2025. There's an error there. But if we look over just the last 7 or 8 years, what we're going to look at is states that have bathroom bans in place. So these bans, for the most part, started really focused on K through 12 schools. But over time, we have seen these evolve to include all government buildings. So it might be the state capitol or your local city hall, and then to go into more government buildings like airports, which when you think about folks who might not even live in your state but are traveling through, what does it mean to potentially put themselves at risk by just going to the bathroom? And then we're seeing them expand into other areas that might include higher education, so dorms on college campuses or facilities like prisons. So Emma, you can go ahead and click go, and we'll just see the progression of these laws over time. So we're now in the place where we have 20 states that have these laws, and you can see the ones in just the orange apply to K through 12 schools only. The red color is K through 12 and some government buildings and spaces. And then the dark kind of brown are K through 12 buildings, are K through 12 and all government buildings and spaces. And something that I think Emma mentioned at some earlier is kind of this way in which state laws preempt local laws. And so this means that even if a city wanted to say, well, we don't want to do that, the way the law is written is that it actually does apply to all government buildings and municipalities. And so cities are running the risk, if they're allowing folks to use the restroom that matches their gender, of violating the law. Emma, we can go back to your slide deck. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
You're good. We can go to the next slide. So, obviously we can sort of look across the country at what's happening, but I think it's really important that we think about what's happening at the federal level. Do you mind going back just one? Thank you.
Oh, that was
Oh,
forward.
you're good. So if we think about how federal and state laws are interplaying, as Emma mentioned, really over the last year, we have seen a rapid progression of anti-LGBTQ and specifically anti-trans policies coming from the federal government. So literally on day one, on Inauguration Day, President Trump signed several executive orders, one of which was sort of called like the anti-gender ideology executive order. And this executive order has had really wide sweeping impacts on trans people across the country. It has led to everything from trans people being forcibly kicked out of the military to sports, Title IX funding being threatened if school districts and states don't force school districts to kick off, trans girls who are playing on the middle school volleyball team. Trans people have struggled to access accurate identity documents like passports and social security cards. The current policy is that the administration will not issue an accurate passport, that they require that the passport reference a sex assigned at birth. And other executive orders have come over about the first couple months of the administration that have touched other areas. One that I want to emphasize in part because of the work that I mentioned earlier around ensuring trans kids can continue to access healthcare is around healthcare. We have seen this administration both through funding threats and litigation and criminal penalty threats go after healthcare providers who do provide care. Currently, there is actually a proposed rule that's open for comment that would strip any funding, Medicaid or Medicaid funding, from any institution that provides access to healthcare for trans youth. And I think it's really critical that we talk about this because it's not just sort of what folks might be thinking about in terms of surgeries for trans youth, it's actually any medical care for trans youth. And this is really dangerous and really scary because literally every hospital in this country receives some Medicaid funding. And many other healthcare providers also receive funding. And so, if the federal government can take away all of that funding for providing care to 50 or 100 youth in a community, that is a really difficult decision for a hospital system to have to make. And the federal government is using that threat of the money and the purse to coerce institutions and states into making really hard decisions that often violate their state laws. So many states actually have laws that protect healthcare providers who are providing care to trans youth. These are called SHIELD laws. And they're designed to help support youth who may be coming to that state from a state like Tennessee or, say, a healthcare provider in Colorado for a child who's coming from Nebraska. And this kind of ability to undermine all of that through ripping away Medicaid funding is just really upending and has the potential to upend the entire healthcare system, both for trans youth and more broadly. And I think it's really scary when you think about what this administration could decide around other issues around healthcare and ways that they might use this same lever to try to coerce other healthcare providers to stop providing other kinds of care that they don't like. I do want to mention that many of these actions have been litigated. We have really brilliant lawyers in our movement. Several of these actions have actually been slowed down or have been put on pause as a result of that litigation. But, the executive order is a powerful tool. It doesn't change the law, but it does direct agencies to do certain things and to put in place certain policies. And we're seeing that happen at very fast progression. Let's go to the next slide, Emma. So, one thing that I think is really critical when we're talking a lot about policy is actually what does it mean for actual people's lives? And we know that there are tens of thousands of LGBTQ people who, for example, live in Tennessee. Tennessee's population of LGBTQ people is roughly about the national average. And something that's interesting is that, and I know someone asked a question in the chat, when you look at the percent of LGBTQ people in the state of Tennessee who are raising children, it's about 1 in 4, or 1 in 3. So we're definitely talking about a lot of people, both in Tennessee and across the country, who are impacted. And so in May and June of 2025, we at MAP conducted a survey of LGBTQ people. It's a nationally representative survey, so it's not just to folks in Tennessee, but it's meant to represent the whole country. And we asked them, what impact has the administration change and anti-LGBTQ laws and policies had on your life? And I want to highlight a couple of things on this chart. What we found is pretty devastating, especially because we asked since November of 2024, what have you done differently in your life? And remember, the survey was fielded in May or June. So in the span of just 6 or 7 months, we found, for example, that 55% of trans people said that they had taken steps to be less visible as a trans person at work or at school. We found that 43% of trans people had considered moving to a different state. And shockingly, 9% had reported that they had already moved. So just in the span of 6 or 7 months, people are making really hard decisions about where they choose to live, what kinds of communities they can be a part of. And we have past research and some research that Emma was a part of, showing that like LGBTQ people live where they live for all the same reasons you live where you live. It's to be close to family. It's where they grew up. It's where they went to school, where they fell in love. And so when we have policies and laws like this, it really puts people into a bind of deciding, can I stay living here and live my life safely, especially for trans people, and access the care that I need? Or do I have to move to be able to get those basic needs met? But at the same time, I think it's really critical that we highlight the resiliency of the LGBTQ community. We have always had to think outside of the box and find ways to take care of ourselves. I've been talking a lot lately about what was happening during the early days of the AIDS epidemic and the way in which government refused to invest in new drugs or to help with care or to even talk about what was happening. And in similar ways to what's happening now around accessing healthcare for trans youth, folks created their own networks. They supported each other and they helped get people what they need. So if you look here on this chart, we'll see, for example, that 42% of trans people and 20% of LGB folks got involved in LGBTQ activism just since November. And I feel like that's really inspiring. Similarly, I found that folks just were seeking out community. So 38% of trans folks and 21% of LGB folks started to get involved in LGBTQ community or recreational opportunities. They sought out the book club or the community center for, a line dancing class or whatever it might be to just be with other people to help feel connected. So I think it's just really important that we recognize like these laws and policies have very tangible impacts on people's lives and that we can't just think about them as sort of the broader picture, but actually what are folks doing and what choices are they being forced into as a result? With that, I'm going to pass it over to Emma to talk a little bit more about what's happening in Tennessee right now.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I think that really like puts it in perspective and definitely resonates with me as, an LGBT Tennessean. So yeah. Um, yes. So I want to talk to you all a little bit about some of the anti-LGBT bills that we're seeing advancing in this legislative session. So let's just get into it. So the first bill, the first section of bills I'm going to talk about are ones that impact LGBT youth. So we have this bill HB 1666, which is essentially an extension of the pronoun bill that I talked about that we already have. So it's saying not only can school employees not be required to use students' pronouns, they also, under this bill, would not be required to use their honorifics. So that means like Mr. and Miss. So if, for example, there was a teacher who is transgender, um, other teachers could call them Mr., even if they are a woman, that kind of thing. So it's really just trying to extend the already harmful policy that we already have. Um, Another bill in the area of non-discrimination is being referred to as the Banning Bostock Act. So, for those who aren't familiar, Bostock v. Clayton was a Supreme Court decision that essentially said that discriminating against people on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation is a violation of the Constitution. And this bill essentially says that here in Tennessee, it would be legal to discriminate against people on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So this is a very unique bill that we haven't seen in other states that some Tennessee lawmakers are trying out. So we're hoping not to see this one advance. There's a few bills in the area of healthcare this year. So this one, SB 1664, HB 1665, prohibits healthcare providers from asking gender-related questions to young people unless their parent or guardian is present and provides consent. This one is problematic because for a lot of young people who are transgender or non-binary, coming out to a provider or a therapist or a school counselor, is really something that they're only safe to do outside of connection with their parents. I think a lot of us know that there are a lot of parents who are not accepting of their LGBT children, and those children can be really struggling and need that safe person to come out to. So this kind of policy would really put those young people's health at risk by sort of removing the safety of being able to come out and talk about that with a doctor or a therapist. Um, this another bill in the area of healthcare, SB 2031, HB 1872, is essentially trying to increase liability for gender affirming care providers. So, gender affirming healthcare is still legal in Tennessee for adults. Um, but this policy would make it so young people who had received gender affirming care in Tennessee or adults who have received gender affirming care in Tennessee can basically take civil action, like sue their provider if they believe that they were coerced into receiving the health care. Um, and just to, like state the facts on gender affirming care, the vast majority of people who receive it are very glad to have received the health care. It's life-saving health care. So this bill is really based on sort of the false idea that people are being coerced into getting this health care rather than seeking out the health care that they need for themselves. Another bill related to healthcare, SB 2045. Um, this bill aims to increase state surveillance of gender affirming care by requiring that healthcare providers um, essentially report the number and types of disciplinary actions taken against providers who give gender affirming care to youth, which is already banned in Tennessee. So it's essentially I think trying to get at if there were any providers who were providing the care in violation of the law, that the state would be made aware of that. But it is illegal, and I can tell you that there are no providers who are providing this care, and people are having to go get it out of state. So I think it's just another effort on their part to, you know, frighten providers out of offering this care. And essentially, what these kind of policies do, it can make providers scared to see trans young people at all for any type of health care. I've heard stories of providers who won't want to, give a like general physical to a trans child because they're afraid that they could be violating some law, which is not the case. But these kind of policies just further muddy the waters and scare providers from doing their jobs. Okay, another healthcare related bill, SB 2118. It prohibits TennCare from covering medical care for trans people. So, as we already covered, TennCare or Medicaid in Tennessee um, does not cover gender affirming surgery or medications. I believe this policy is just trying to cover any type of care that isn't already covered in the existing policy. So, like, something I can think of is like laser hair removal that some transgender women might receive. Maybe they feel that that isn't adequately covered in the TennCare policy already, so they're feeling that they need to cover that base. But yeah, it's just another extension of a policy that we already have. Okay, this policy has to do with relationships and families. So SB 1746, HB 1473. Um, it says that private citizens and organizations are not required to recognize the marriages of same-sex couples, and it allows individuals to refuse to officiate a marriage for a same-sex couple. So this bill would not be banning same-sex marriage in Tennessee. It would just be saying that attorneys or individuals cannot be forced to officiate the wedding of a same-sex couple. Um, so it's just them kind of doing whatever they can, I think, to go after um, marriage for same-sex couples. Another bill having to do with relationships and families, SB 1989, HB 2082. It specifies that a parent or guardian's refusal to affirm their child's gender identity doesn't constitute child abuse, and it can't be considered a negative factor by a court in a custody arrangement. So we're seeing a lot of these policies, yes, that are essentially saying that if a parent does not affirm their transgender child, that is not considered abuse. It cannot be used against them in custody, things like that. So a lot of policies trying to protect parents who don't affirm their trans or gender diverse kids. Then finally, we have the No Pride Flag or Month Act. This bill would ban state agencies from displaying pride flags or recognizing Pride Month. So any state organization like the state parks, they couldn't have a pride flag. They couldn't put out an Instagram post saying Happy Pride Month, that kind of thing. So just trying to really remove that sort of celebratory or safe place for LGBT Tennesseans in our state government. Okay, and then finally, this might be one that y'all have heard about. It's been getting a lot of press coverage. It's another bill having to do with drag, and it says that any business that hosts a drag event will be categorized as an adult-oriented establishment. And upon first reading this, I was like, okay, like why is that such a big deal? But it is kind of a big deal because adult-oriented establishments have a lot of other restrictions placed on them, so they can't be within a certain distance from a school. There's, like other things like that. So if, for example, a coffee shop hosted a drag story hour, they could be categorized as an adult-oriented establishment, and have all these additional restrictions placed on them. So it's really just a policy that's trying to prevent businesses from hosting events with drag. And I'll pass it back to Naomi after all of
Yeah.
that. And I'm happy to take questions about any of those.
Yeah. Well, I think just everyone like take a deep breath. I think it is a lot. And I think part of what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what does success look like? What does success look like in a place like Tennessee? What does success look like across the country? And I think that, many of the bills that Emma mentioned, often as a movement, we think about, killing a bill, having a vote on the floor and having more no's than yeses on a bad bill or having more yeses than no's on a good bill. And I think that particularly in moments like this, we need to think about how do we reframe around success, and that success might be a committee chair, even a Republican committee chair who, his party might be behind the bill, but not letting it come up to a vote in a committee, not moving it out of committee, or the kind of quiet work that might be happening so that folks don't actually have to take a vote, but it just never comes up for a vote, because that is also a win, right? It stops the bill from moving. I think there's also work, and especially in places like Tennessee and Florida and Georgia. I know this is happening in North Carolina right now. How can we understand that a bill might be moving, but how can we reduce the harms of it? How can we help to write in, let's say, an expiration date on the bill, that this law is only going to be in effect for a certain amount of time, or that there are certain provisions that are less harmful to our community, that is actually success sometimes, is getting those things into a bill. Similarly, I think, especially as we've seen in states like Florida and other places, it's been critical to think about the work that we do to help spread the word about what's going on and how critical these issues are, that in and of itself is success, that when we work in coalition, when we grow the tent, that those are muscles and connective tissue that we will be able to use for years to come on a number of issues. And so I can raise, for example, the example in Florida, where there was a similar sort of don't say LGBTQ law that was being debated. And at the same time, they were also trying to pass what's called the Stop Woke Act, that was really attacking DEI efforts. And recognizing how intertwined these issues are, the ability to talk accurately about US history, the enslavement of Black people, or what has happened to Indigenous communities, is those censorship bans are similar to what's going on with books around queer families or about queer youth. And so when communities can come together and coalitions can form, even if the law is passed, which they did in Florida, for example, those organizations and those coalitions now have relationships, they have trust, so that when things happen again, you don't have to start from scratch. And I think we need to be thinking about that kind of longer game of how can we be building more connections among organizations and people who have similar values. I also think we can work outside of the legislative process and the regulatory process. There are lots of ways that we can help support community, that we can um, stand on the side of a street and hold a sign, the way that we can show support. And Emma is certainly going to talk a little bit later about mutual aid and the way that we can just make sure that people are still getting what they need, even if the laws have changed. And if you can go to the next slide, let's show some data about stopping bills. So we at MAP track laws and policies. We also track legislation that's been introduced across the country. There's a lot on this slide. I'll kind of walk you through it. But we looked from 2010 to 2024 at the number of anti-LGBTQ bills introduced across the country. That's that orange line. So in 2010, for example, 116 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced, spiking in 2023 at 571 anti-LGBTQ bills. I will note this doesn't include 2025. We were tracking more than 700 anti-LGBTQ bills. But what's impressive is when you look at the number that actually went into law. Those are those orange bars down there at the bottom. So it certainly has been going up. And in 2023, we saw 77 anti-LGBTQ laws go into effect, and many of those are incredibly harmful. I don't want to discount that. But if you look at the green line toward the top, this is the percentage of bills introduced that never went into law, that never became law. And I think this is really where we need to sort of look for some hope here, which is we consistently are defeating about 92% of the anti-LGBTQ bills that are introduced in a given year. And this is the hard work of coalitions. This is the hard work of committee chairs that are like, I just don't want to have to deal with this issue. Let's just let it die. This is the hard work of advocates. This is the hard work of community leaders. And I think we need to remember this, that bad things will pass. But if we can continue to stop the fringe bills, the most extreme bills, if we can continue to mitigate some of those harms, that is a win. Emma, let's go to the next slide. And back over to you about the work that's
Awesome.
happening that you're doing right here in Tennessee.
Yeah, so if you've heard all of this and you're wanting to get involved, I have good news for you. The Tennessee Equality Project, which I hope some of y'all have heard of, is doing amazing legislative organizing here in Tennessee. So they're up at the State House in Nashville almost every day of the legislative session. They're bringing people in from across the state, so Knoxville, Chattanooga, Memphis, Mountain City, wherever you live. They have local chairs for the organization who are organizing locally. Um, yeah, so if you want to get involved with legislative work, if you want to be directly involved with like going to talk to your lawmakers and really trying to defeat some of these bills, I would highly recommend reaching out to them. Their website, tnep.org, is an amazing resource. They post weekly blogs where they list all of the actions, including like phone banking, emails, or showing up in person that you can do every week of the legislative session. They're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok at TN Equality. Those are great places to find out about what actions they're taking, what events you can go to. Their day on the Hill was actually yesterday, or else I would be telling you all about that, but it went great. Yeah, so highly recommend getting involved with them if you're interested in organizing against these policies. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the resources available from Campaign for Southern Equality for LGBT folks in Tennessee. So the first resource I want to talk about is the Trans Youth Emergency Project. This is our only national program at the Campaign for Southern Equality, and it started as a local program. back in 2022, we first started seeing states, including Tennessee, which was one of the first to ban gender affirming care for youth. As Naomi shared, since then, 27 states have passed these bans. So the Trans Youth Emergency Project works to help families who are impacted by the bans. So families with trans kids who need to access this health care. We help them travel across state lines to get that care from a provider that can legally offer it. So we offer those families one-on-one patient navigation calls. So we have folks who can actually get on the phone with them and talk them through finding a provider. We offer them travel grants of $500, which are renewable every 3 months, so that they can get to every appointment that they need to get to. And then we also offer a network of care and information for families. So we have regular town halls whenever policies change, which has been frequent in the past few years. We have a lot of amazing information on our website about local policies around gender affirming care. Um, and we also have a support group for parents and caregivers of trans youth. So it's a monthly support group really targeted at parents who have trans kids who are navigating the maze of trying to access gender affirming care for their kids. The next session is Sunday, February 15th, so this Sunday. So if you know any parents who are kind of in this situation, this is a great space for them to connect with other people who are having to struggle through that as well. We also have some really great resources for folks across the South who are wanting to organize for LGBT equality in their schools. We have a program called Supportive Schools, where folks can get access to training and workshops, policy guidance, and just support on challenging anti-LGBT school policies. So most of the work they do is in North Carolina, but they are available and are wanting to get more involved here in Tennessee. I think that's it, actually. So yeah,
Yeah.
do we have questions? I feel like we might because I feel like we just gave you a ton of information.
Well, we have some great questions in the chat, and Naomi's been responding, but I think it might be
Yeah.
valuable for the group as a whole. Why don't we go to gallery view? I'm going to do gallery view. Maybe you could quit sharing, Emma, so we could see people's faces. That would be great. Thank you. I'm going to read even though, again, has been answering questions, I think it's good for all of us to have the opportunity. So Dale asked the question, how are families and same-sex parents treated in public schools? In kindergarten and first grade, typically much of the curriculum is focused on family. Are lesbian or gay parents represented in the classroom family pictures, treated the same as heterosexual parents in the classroom and at parent-teacher conferences, etc.? And again, Naomi, you had a great answer on chat, but maybe you'd like to just state it again.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, part of what we've seen with the sort of so-called don't say LGBTQ laws, these curriculum censorship laws, is in some places, it actually does say, between certain ages, um, curriculum that talks about sexuality, talks about sexual orientation and gender identity is not permitted. And unfortunately, that often means that curriculum or books about just family diversity get wrapped up in that. And you're right, when kids are in kindergarten or first grade, they're just talking about who's in their family. And my son would have proudly said, well, my two moms do X or Y. And the teachers report feeling very nervous and hesitant about what to say, that they're nervous about affirming and saying, that's great. Tell me more about your family, or reading a book that has diverse families, that those books are being taken out of libraries. So it's definitely a concern. And I think that often there's sort of over compliance in these situations where the book isn't actually about sex or sexual orientation, sort of beyond just families come in all shapes and sizes. And I think that's part of where it's critical to talk about like how harmful that is. That many of us come from diverse families. And it's important that we are able to talk about that with our kids and that our kids feel affirmed in the classroom. So there's both an impact on the queer families and the teachers, and obviously the kids who just feel excited about what their family looks like and want to talk about it.
Yeah, I can speak on sort of a personal level, my mom is an elementary school teacher in Powell in Knox County. And she has an amazing advocate in her ear telling her that she can legally have books about, same-sex families in her classroom, but she's scared to do that because she knows it's a hostile climate. And I think a lot of teachers in Tennessee feel that way, especially in, more conservative counties.
Another good question. What are the primary narratives used to push the anti-LGBTQ agenda? Is it religion? Something else?
Emma, do you want to start with what you're seeing and hearing? I know you were on the Capitol yesterday.
Yeah, I think people definitely try to use religion to push the anti-LGBT agenda. We also had a lot of great folks at the Capitol yesterday who are people of faith, a lot of Methodist folks and people from the Unitarian Universalist tradition who are coming to sort of give the perspective that I'm a Christian and my faith doesn't tell me to push these kind of anti-LGBT agenda. It actually tells me that I should, love my neighbor and support LGBT people. So yeah, I think definitely religion is a big player. And I think it's really hopeful to see people of faith kind of pushing back against that. Um, yeah.
I would just add to that. I think there's what's been interesting is certainly there's always been a religious kind of orientation, an anti-LGBTQ orientation, and a use of that. But I think that part of what we've seen over the last 5 years is actually a resurgence of what we saw in the 70s, which is more around how LGBTQ people are harmful to children, that they, want to hurt kids, that, they shouldn't be teachers. Think about the Briggs Amendment in California and so forth. And so some of what we've seen, when you think about the drag bans, for example, is often just like, this isn't good for kids. This is indecent, and really pushing that kind of narrative. We've seen, discussions about people grooming kids and these different things. And it's really rooted in, I think, sort of a lack of comfort and stereotypes that are really deep seated and quite old, but they're coming back. And I think that's why it's so important that we talk about the LGBTQ people in our lives that we know, because it can just help break that down. We'll say, well, Sally down the street, she is a lesbian. Like she comes to the neighborhood potlucks, like just breaking that down. Because I think it's so easy to get caught up in the media narratives or the examples that people see, but actually to root it in like your own experience, either as an LGBTQ person or with people in your family or in your community that you love and know. Because that's where we find people are like, oh, you're right. I just am hearing about this stuff out there, but actually in our community, that's not, in my church, that's not our experience, or in our neighborhood, that's not our experience. And so really sort of pushing back against these narratives that are out there. And I think similarly, we're seeing on trans issues a lot of narrative just around how this isn't real, that trans people don't know themselves, that this isn't an innate part of who they are, that this is to get ahead in sports, or it's to defraud someone, or it's to go into a restroom and commit a crime. And what's really critical is to say, just like you know who you are, trans people know themselves and trans kids know themselves deeply. And it's just a part of who they are, just like if you're right-handed or just like these other things. And how do we help kind of push back against those narratives that this is because of media influence and it's not real? And I think the more we can sort of come back to trans kids are who they are. I think all of us who have raised kids know like your kids kind of come out the way they are. Like my kid came out loving trucks. Like I did nothing to influence that. That is like just a core part of who he is. And I think the more we can connect with parents around that of like, your kid. This is just the same for trans kids. They know deeply who they are and we need to affirm them. So I think those are some of the narratives that we've seen and important ways to push back against those.
Another question here is, are there any bills ongoing regarding book bans?
I
That may
can
not be that may be in a different category.
I can speak a bit to that. So I'm sure some of y'all heard about the Age Appropriate Materials Act, which passed in Tennessee, um, and was a bit vague, but essentially said that all books in Tennessee schools had to be age appropriate, not sexually explicit, etc. And since that passage, we have seen school districts are having to determine for themselves what books they are removing and including. So if you look at, I can send the link, but there's a group called PIN America, which tracks at the school district level what books are being taken off the shelves. And we've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of books. I mean, I think it's definitely thousands of books being taken off the shelves in Tennessee as a result of that. I was actually looking into my own high school, Oak Ridge High School, and was like shocked to see that they removed like 300 books last year, including some books that were super impactful for me. So we're definitely seeing that happening. We also have seen the Tennessee Secretary of State, who oversees all the libraries in the state, like all the public libraries, send a letter to every library saying that they need to remove any inappropriate books from the children's sections. So those libraries are now tasked with interpreting what that means and implementing that in the ways that they think that they should. So it's a lot of these sort of like vague directives from the state, and then the schools and the libraries are being tasked with implementing them, and some are implementing them really heavy-handedly, and some are pushing back. So that's what I would say on that, but it's definitely an ongoing issue.
And I think
Right.
there, the thing that, we keep focusing on is the idea that, we want to prepare our children for living and working in a diverse world. And when they don't have access to books that either reflect who they are or help them think about the world in a broader way, we're actually doing them a disservice. And I think to Emma's point, like educators and librarians, that's their whole role is to help guide kids, help them find books that appeal to their interests that are age appropriate, right? No one is pointing a 5-year-old to Beloved. That is not happening, right? But teenagers, there are opportunities for a teacher to say, wow, I know you're really interested in X. Let me show you this book. Like that, those are things that we want to encourage and that are really critical for what we want our kids to be able to do when they launch into the world. And so I think being able to talk about what books were meaningful to you, the way that, they helped you grow, I think is an important piece when we think about these book bans. And, that censorship is really scary and wrong, but also that human connection.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Well, then I'm going to ask everyone if you would, in your own way, please say thank you for the wonderful presentation we've had. It was enlightening and actually encouraging. So thank you both so much, and thank everyone for attending. And material will be available in a few days. Again, thank you very much, and have a
Thank
lovely evening.
you.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Good night.